From their rough upbringing in sunny California to their mixed record at the UFC, here's everything you need to know about Nick and Nate Diaz. The two brothers had a bit of a mixed relationship with the UFC and Dana White, and their tenure at the promotion didn't go the way they'd hoped. But one thing's for sure, they came a long way from their rough childhood in Stockton, California. Look, you might think that Cali is all about waves and babes, but that's not quite the experience that the Diaz brothers had. For starters, their father was barely around while they were growing up, so their mom practically raised them on her own. She happened to be an honest woman who earned an honest living, unlike the rest of the people in their neighborhood who dealt in narcotics. While the children of these dealers went to school dressed to the nines, the Diaz brothers were barely scraping by. You might look at their rough faces and brash demeanor and think that they were bullies in high school, but that couldn't be further from the truth. The same blunt, no-nonsense personality that made Nick a favorite among UFC fans actually made him the target of some vicious bullies when he was a kid. But here's the thing, he never let his little brother experience anything like that. According to Nate, his big brother defended him and made sure he felt safe. And how did the older Diaz manage this? Well, by learning how to fight, of course, starting with karate and aikido when he was just a little kid. Nate always looked up to his brother, so he decided to start learning karate alongside him when he was 11. Both of them took to combat sports like fish to water. It was like they'd finally found their purpose, and Nick immediately made waves when he started training under BJJ Master Cesar Gracie. If we take Cesar at his word, the kid was an absolute natural from day one. And that makes sense, because the guy's a beast who looks like he was born to battle it out in the octagon. And his little brother is no different. I mean, Nick trained in multiple martial arts, including Sambo. Now, if you need any indication of how highly skilled he is, just know that he learned this Russian martial art from Valery Ignatov, aka the former Bulgarian national champion. Nate wasn't far behind, getting into his first competitive MMA match at the tender age of 17 against a guy named Robert Lyman. It seemed like they were destined for greatness from the get-go, and they certainly had the work ethic and determination to make it in life. Unfortunately, their path to success was paved with tragedy, and Nick in particular had to deal with some truly horrible stuff when he was a teenager. You see, Nick was in love with this girl named Stephanie, and things did not end well between them. I'm not talking about a failed teenage romance here. This girl was seriously troubled, and while she and Nick were dating, she attempted to take her own life on 3 separate occasions. The third attempt proved to be fatal, with Stephanie walking into oncoming traffic. This left Nick utterly devastated, but it also filled him with a fire that just wouldn't go out. Stephanie supported Nick's dream of becoming a pro fighter, and after she died, he went to her grave every single day to tell her he'd be everything she wanted him to be. After a tumultuous childhood, Nick and Nate thrust themselves headfirst into the intense world of pro combat sports. They both had some experience with unsanctioned MMA fights, but they weren't satisfied with such low-level bouts. What they wanted, more than anything else, was to make something of themselves, and they both got their chance shortly after coming of age. Nick made his professional debut for the IFC Warriors on August 31st, 2001, as a lightweight, forcing his opponent into submission with a triangle choke in under 4 minutes. He'd barely been 18 for a month, and he was already making a mark on the pro combat circuit. As for Nate, he got his start with World Extreme Cage Fighting on October 21st, 2004, and almost as if it had been ordained by fate, he used the exact same chokehold as his brother to win his first bout. A few months before his little brother started his career, Nick made the jump to the UFC. The guy seemed to love forcing his opponents into submission, cause that's exactly how his first fight ended. When he went up against Jeremy Jackson, it took Nick just over 2 minutes to get him into an armbar that there was no coming back from. For his second bout, he outdid himself by knocking out Robbie Lawler in all of 91 seconds, showing just the right mixture of brutality and commitment. Now, he might have lost his third fight in a split decision, but Nick was making his mark thanks to his keen BJJ abilities, and coupled with his stellar grappling skills, it made for a pretty lethal combo. Nate wasn't too far behind, appearing on the 5th season of The Ultimate Fighter. It was all about lightweights that season, and Nate managed to show some serious skills as part of Jens Pulver's team. He defeated 3 opponents in a row via submission, and after Manvel Gamburian dislocated his shoulder after a botched takedown attempt, he came out on top through a technical knockout. This meant that he had a UFC contract in the bag, and his career got off to a roaring start when he locked Junior Asunção into a guillotine choke at UFC Fight Night on September 19, 2001. But while he was coming up the ranks, his brother was showing the first public signs of an addiction that threatened to bring everything down. At Pride 33, Nick's victory against Takanori Gomi was overturned after he tested positive for a certain green herb. It was a lifelong habit, and one that would get him into trouble multiple times over his career. Dana's often talked about this with the tone of a disappointed father, or maybe like the mean uncle that gives you a hard time at Thanksgiving. According to Dana, Nick only has to steer clear of the herb for 24 hours before his fights, but even that was too much for him. Now, Nick was dealing with a lot at this time, and you might be wondering why he was fighting for Pride in the first place. After 3 consecutive losses, his relationship with the UFC had soured quite a bit. Dana had some serious issues with Nick, because the guy never had much of a stomach for theatrics. He was all about punching in and going home, and when you factor in his losing streak, it's no surprise that he wanted to leave the UFC behind. After his narcotics test came back positive, Nick was handed a 6-month suspension and a $3,000 fine. This wouldn't be the last time he'd end up on the wrong side of the rules. He spent a few years fighting for Elite XC, Strikeforce, and Dream before making a comeback to the UFC. But things just weren't the same anymore. Nate had been having a rough time in Dana White's corner of the world, with 8 wins and 5 losses to his name by the time his brother returned. This is when Nick started an infamous war of words with Georges St. Pierre, one that ended with him losing via unanimous decision in the octagon. He announced his retirement from MMA not long after the fight, eventually making a comeback against Anderson Silva. But things were only going to get worse from there. The fight went to the spider, but that was the least of Nick's concerns, because the green herb showed up again in the post-bout test. As a result, the Nevada State Athletic Commission banned him for 5 whole years and forced him to pay a $165,000 fine. Now, the suspension was ultimately lifted, but Nick would only return to the octagon once more, when Robbie Lawler, the man he'd once knocked out in his second fight, defeated him via TKO. To be fair, he was kind of out of practice, because he'd been busy hyping up his brother. Nate's beef with Conor McGregor was truly a sight to behold, and the fact that it ended with him defeating the Notorious with a rear naked choke seemed downright historic. But this turned out to be the final significant victory in the Diaz saga. McGregor won the rematch by a majority decision, and Nate eventually left the UFC after 4 more matches. In the end, Diaz's mixed record does a real disservice to their dedication to the sport. Neither brother won a title at the UFC. Nick ended with 26 wins and 10 losses, while Nate managed 21 wins and 13 losses. But these two battled it out with titans like GSP and Conor McGregor, earned their respect, and made a name for themselves. Nowadays, Nick is busy teaching, and he also appeared in a Jean-Claude Van Damme movie. Nate ended up getting beaten by Jake Paul, of all people, and has another boxing match against Jorge Masvidal set for the summer of 2024. Their legacy wasn't quite what they'd hoped it would be, but for 2 kids from Stockton, they did more than anyone could have dreamed. So from their mixed record at the UFC to their tough childhood in California, this was everything you needed to know about Nick and Nate Diaz.